Franklin Miller never expected betrayal to come wrapped in a suit and spoken in a voice colder than the Texas winter. At 82, he had grown used to silence, to the slow rhythm of mornings alone with his black coffee and a biscuit drizzled with honey. But nothing prepared him for the moment. His eldest son, David Miller, stepped through the doorway with a young attorney in tow. The lawyer carried a thin folder, his navy jacket pressed and stiff, while David stood with arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. No greeting, no handshake, not even a glance of respect. Just 7 words that cut sharper than any blade. We sold the house. You have to leave. Across that small kitchen table sat Franklin's grandson, Michael, a lanky 17-year-old, who had always admired the man who raised generations inside those walls. Michael's face tightened with disbelief as his father delivered the sentence, treating Franklin less like blood and more like an obstacle. This house, wasn't just a roof of shingles and brick. It was the place Franklin had built, with his late wife Margaret, every nail hammered with sweat and love. As the lawyer set down the papers, the room fell into a silence heavier than stone. Franklin's weathered hands stayed steady on his coffee cup, but inside a storm had begun. This was no simple property dispute. This was a father being discarded by his own son, and the first spark of a battle that would test blood, loyalty, and dignity itself. Franklin Miller sat there in silence long after his son and the lawyer had walked out, the echo of their words still circling in the kitchen like a cold draft. He glanced around the room at the faded wallpaper Margaret had picked out back in '76, at the wooden cabinets he'd built with his own hands when money was tight. Every corner of this house whispered a memory, and suddenly those memories felt like they were slipping from his grasp. To David it was just a property. To Franklin it was sacred ground. He remembered the summer he poured the concrete foundation with 2 buddies from the trucking yard, sweat dripping off his back while Margaret brought out lemonade in mason jars. He could still picture her smile, teasing him for laying bricks too slowly because he wanted every line to be perfect. Back then, they had nothing but grit, a dream, and each other. They didn't buy this home, they built it from scratch, piece by piece, paycheck by paycheck. In the living room, Franklin's eyes settled on the old piano. Dusty now, but once alive with the sound of Margaret teaching hymns to the boys on Sunday afternoons. The Christmas tree had always gone in the corner by the window, where the lights could shine onto the street. He saw the ghosts of Laughter Michael as a little boy tearing into presents, David running through the hallways with socks, sliding across the wood floor, Mark the younger son, banging pots in the kitchen just to make noise. The house had held every joy and every sorrow, and then came the darkest chapter. The night Margaret lost her battle to cancer, Franklin had sat right there in the den, staring at her empty chair. The house, once so alive, had turned unbearably quiet. For weeks he considered leaving, but each wall held her voice. Each floorboard carried her footsteps. Somehow, the silence became a kind of companionship. It wasn't easy, but he learned to breathe again under this roof. To imagine giving it up now, especially by force, by the hands of his own son, was unthinkable. Franklin closed his eyes and ran his rough palms across the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret used to roll out pie crusts. He could almost hear her gentle voice saying what she always said when things went wrong. "Hold your ground, Frank. Don't let anyone take what we built." That memory struck him deeper than David's betrayal. It wasn't just about walls and shingles. It was about a life, love, and the dignity of never being erased. The more he thought, the clearer it became. Something was wrong with those papers the lawyer had shown. Franklin had never signed away his rights. He knew every inch of his name, every curve of his signature, and he hadn't put it on any contract. If they thought he was too old or too broken to notice, they were mistaken. His mind was slower, his body weaker, but his will, that was still iron. For a moment, Franklin considered the easy path, packing a bag, letting the house go, avoiding the fight. At 82, wasn't he too old for battles? But then he remembered the young man he once was, the one who drove 18-wheelers through snowstorms, the one who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, the one who stood by Margaret's bedside until her very last breath, That man was still in him, just older, quieter, but no less determined. He stood, walked to the living room, and touched the frame of a family photo hanging on the wall. In it, David was only 10, holding Margaret's hand, smiling without a care. Franklin swallowed hard. How does a boy who once clung to his mother with that much love grow into a man cold enough to steal from his own father? The thought stung, but it also lit a spark inside him. By the time he returned to his chair, Franklin wasn't just an old man nursing hurt feelings. He was a husband remembering his promise, a father remembering his sacrifices, and a man realizing he still had one fight left in him. This house was more than property, it was proof of a life worth defending. And deep down, Franklin knew, if he walked away without resisting, it wouldn't just be the loss of his home, it would be the loss of himself. That night, Franklin couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, turning slow circles above him, each rotation carrying the weight of what had just happened. The papers, the lawyer, the betrayal etched into his son's eyes. For a man who had spent his entire life keeping the peace, staying out of fights, this was the first time in decades he felt something burning deep inside him. Not rage exactly, but a fire. A fire that comes when someone tries to strip away everything you are. He rose before dawn, poured himself a cup of black coffee, and walked through the quiet house. The creak of the floorboards under his feet reminded him that he was still standing. Still here? In the corner of the kitchen, his old dog Rusty lifted his head and wagged his tail. Franklin bent down, scratched him gently behind the ear, and whispered, "Don't worry, boy. We're not going anywhere." For years, Franklin had avoided conflict. He was the man who let neighbors park in his driveway without complaint. The man who stayed silent when coworkers got the credit for his hard work. Even in his family, he had chosen patience over argument. But what happened yesterday crossed a line. It wasn't just about property, it was about dignity. And Margaret's voice, still alive in his memory, echoed clearly, "Stand your ground, Frank. Never give up what you've built." By mid-morning, Franklin made a decision. He dusted off an old leather folder from under his bed, the one where he kept every important document, the deed, tax records, even the first property survey from 40 years ago. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, but inside was the truth, his truth. Every page bore his name, his signature, his hard-earned claim to the home that was now under attack. A thought cut through him like cold steel. If I didn't sign anything, then someone else did. Someone had taken his name and twisted it into a weapon against him. That realization didn't just hurt, it steeled him. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't weak. He had been wronged. The next morning, Franklin walked into town wearing his cleanest shirt and his old gray jacket, the one Margaret had bought him for their 25th anniversary. His steps were slow but steady, each one a decision. Neighbors nodded as he passed by, unaware of the storm beneath his calm expression. He stopped first at the church, lighting a candle beneath the statue of St. Joseph, not because he was asking for a miracle, but because he needed clarity, the kind Margaret always gave him when she was alive. As the small flame flickered, he whispered under his breath, "Help me do this right." Afterward, Franklin walked to Main Street and climbed the steps to a small notary office where his old friend, Henry Lawson, now worked. Henry had been a bus driver back in the day, and though he never earned a law degree, he'd spent decades surrounded by paperwork and legal filings. He greeted Franklin warmly, but when Franklin laid out the story, the sudden sale, the contract, the betrayal, Henry's expression hardened. He studied the documents carefully, adjusting his glasses as his brow furrowed deeper. "Frank," Henry finally said, "this doesn't add up. You're the only legal owner. If your son pushed through a sale without your signature, that's fraud. Pure and simple." The words landed heavy, but strangely Franklin felt lighter. He wasn't imagining things. Wasn't some old man confused by legal talk. What had been done was wrong, plain wrong. Henry gave him the name of a respected attorney in Dallas, someone who specialized in property fraud and family disputes. The way home, Franklin stopped at the park and sat on a bench. Children played nearby, their laughter rising like sunlight. He thought of David as a boy, running through yards barefoot, chasing fireflies at dusk. How had that boy turned into? The man who now saw his father as a burden instead of a blessing? The question cut deep, but Franklin refused to let sorrow drown him. He straightened his back and whispered into the breeze, "I may be old, but I'm not invisible." That night, Franklin sat on his porch, the air cool against his skin, Rusty at his feet. For the first time in a long time, he felt a different kind of tiredness, not the weariness of loss, but the exhaustion that comes right before a fight he was ready to face. This wasn't just about saving a house. It was about saving himself from silence, from being erased, from becoming a ghost in his own story. And Franklin Miller, quiet and gentle as he had always been, knew with certainty the fire inside him had only just begun to burn. The next morning, Franklin woke up before the sun, the way he used to when he drove long hauls across Texas. Only this time, he wasn't climbing into a rig. He was preparing for something far heavier. He sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and an old ballpoint pen. His handwriting had grown shaky over the years, but the words came out steady. A list. Not of groceries or chores, but of truths. What David thought he knew, what he didn't know, and what Franklin wanted him to believe. It wasn't anger that pushed him, it was clarity. For the first time in years, Franklin felt like he had a plan. He would not let himself be treated like an unwanted piece of furniture. He would stand his ground, but he'd do it smart. Later that week, the sound of knuckles on the front door broke the quiet. Rusty barked from the porch, his tail stiff. Franklin rose slowly, bracing himself, and opened the door. There was David, standing alone this time. No lawyer, no folder of papers, just his son, with a face lined by tension. His shirt was wrinkled, his jaw tight. "Dad," David started, voice low, "we need to talk." Franklin didn't step aside right away. For a long moment, he let his son stand there in the Texas heat, sweat forming on his brow. Then, with a sigh, he opened the screen door. "Kitchen," he said simply. They sat across from each other at the old wooden table. Franklin poured 2 cups of coffee, but only drank from his own. David stared at the steam curling above his untouched mug. Finally, David spoke. "I heard you've been talking to lawyers. Dad, it didn't have to get this far." Franklin leaned back, steadying his voice. "Didn't have to. Son, you walked into this house with a stranger and told me it wasn't mine anymore. You didn't come to talk. You came to erase me." David's eyes flickered downward. Didn't deny it, but he searched for an excuse. "We needed money. The house had value. It was practical. Franklin's voice didn't rise, but the weight in it was undeniable. "I raised you under this roof. I carried you to the hospital when your lungs gave out at midnight. Your mother cooked every meal at that stove. And you call it practical. To sell me out of my own life?" Silence hung heavy. Then, before David could answer, another voice came from the hallway. "Is that true, Dad?" It was Ethan, David's son, Franklin's grandson. 17 years old, tall and thin, with a mess of dark hair falling over his eyes. He had come by after school, unaware of the storm brewing. Now, standing in the kitchen doorway, he looked between his father and grandfather, waiting for Anne. Answered David shifted uncomfortably. "Ethan, this isn't." But Ethan cut him off. "No, don't tell me it's not my business. Grandpa's family. You don't treat family like that." Franklin's chest tightened. He hadn't expected this moment, not so soon, and certainly not from the boy who usually stayed quiet in family disputes. But Ethan's eyes burned with a conviction. Franklin recognized the same stubborn fire Margaret used to have. David pushed back his chair and stood, frustration etched across his face. "You don't understand, son. You're just a kid." "I understand enough," Ethan shot back. "You tried to take his house. You tried to push him out. I'm not okay with that." The words echoed in the room like a hammer striking steel. Franklin stood as well, placing a hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. "Easy, boy," he said softly. "This fight isn't yours to carry. Not yet." But deep inside, Franklin felt a warmth he hadn't known in years, a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone after all. David grabbed his keys from the counter, jaw clenched. Before leaving, he muttered, "You're making a mistake, Dad." Franklin looked him straight in the eye. "No, son. The mistake was thinking I'd go quietly." The door shut hard behind him, rattling the frame. For a long while, the house was still, except for Rusty's soft panting at Franklin's feet. Ethan finally turned to his grandfather. "Ever happens, I'm with you." Franklin squeezed his grandson's shoulder, his voice steady but tender. "That means more than, you know?" That night, Franklin sat alone on the porch, watching the horizon fade into dusk. He thought of Margaret, of her gentle strength. He thought of David and the bridge between them that now seemed broken beyond repair. And he thought of Ethan, the unexpected ally who had just stepped into the storm, for the first time since the betrayal. Franklin didn't feel like an old man cornered in his own home. He felt like a fighter. And this time, he wasn't fighting alone. The morning after David stormed out, Franklin sat in his recliner, staring at the manila folder he had pulled from the drawer in his bedroom. Inside were the yellow deeds, the property tax receipts, the original title papers he and Margaret had guarded for decades. His name was on every line, every signature, clear as day. Franklin traced a finger over the ink, thinking of the lawyer who had stood in his kitchen holding a document claiming, otherwise, a lie plain and simple. And if someone could forge his name once, they could do it again. For the first time, he realized this wasn't just about family betrayal, it was about fraud. By mid-morning, Franklin buttoned up a clean plaid shirt, combed back his silver hair, and walked down Main Street toward the small office of his old friend, Harold Jenkins. Years ago, they had both driven trucks on the same route, and now Harold worked as a clerk at the county courthouse. Harold greeted him with a warm hug and 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "What brings you here, Frank?" he asked, though his eyes already sensed the weight. Franklin laid the folder on the desk and spoke plainly. "Harold, someone's trying to steal my home, and I think my own son signed papers he had no right to sign." Harold's face darkened. As he flipped through the documents, he made a few calls, took photos, and finally said, "Frank, you're still the rightful owner. If there's another contract floating around, it's built on sand. You need a real attorney, someone who knows property law, someone who won't be pushed around." He scribbled a name on a scrap of paper. Linda Chavez, attorney at law, a woman with a reputation for taking on tough cases, especially when it came to seniors being cheated out of their rights. The very next day, Franklin made his way to Linda's office in Dallas. She was in her 40s, sharpened, with a handshake that told you she meant business. She didn't pity him. She didn't talk down to him. She listened, patiently, carefully. As Franklin recounted every detail from the morning David arrived with the lawyer, to the papers spread across his kitchen table, to Ethan stepping in to defend him. When he finished, Linda tapped her pen against her notebook and said, "Mr. Miller, what's been done to you isn't just wrong, it's illegal. Forgery, misrepresentation, maybe even conspiracy. If we move fast, we can file a motion to freeze any sale and request a handwriting analysis to prove your signature was forged." Franklin sat back, a lump forming in his throat. Hearing someone put words like illegal and forgery to the betrayal made his chest tighten. He asked softly, "Does that mean my son could go to jail?" Linda paused, then said, "The court will decide that. But first, our priority is protecting you, your home, your rights, and your dignity." That word again. Dignity. Margaret had said it so often when she was alive. "Frank, we can live lean, but never live without dignity." So he nodded. "Do what you have to do. Won't be run out of my own house." Linda filed the paperwork the very same afternoon. Within days, Franklin learned that a judge had placed a temporary block on any attempt to sell the property. The first time since this nightmare began, he felt the ground steady under his boots. But victory didn't come without cost. That evening, Ethan showed up at the house with a backpack slung over his shoulder. His parents had been fighting loud, ugly arguments that shook the walls. Mom's furious. Dad's quiet as stone. "I just needed to be here," the boy admitted. Franklin opened the door wide and let him in. Over supper beans, cornbread, and sweet Ethan said, "Grandpa, whatever happens in court, I'm proud you didn't just roll over. You showed me something I'll never forget." Franklin smiled faintly, hiding the ache in his chest. He hadn't wanted his grandson caught in the middle of this war. Yet in that moment, he realized the fight wasn't just for him. It was for the next generation too, to teach them that silence in the face of injustice is its own kind of defeat. Later, as the house grew quiet and Ethan drifted to sleep in the spare bedroom, Franklin sat by the window with the legal folder. On his lap, the papers weren't just ink and signatures. They were his proof, his shield, his answer to anyone who thought age meant weakness. And as he listened to the Texas night hum with cicadas, Franklin whispered into the dark, "Margaret, I'm doing this for us. They won't take what we built, not while I still draw breath." The day of the hearing arrived with a cold drizzle falling over Dallas. Franklin Miller rose before dawn, just as he always had when he used to drive trucks across the state. He brewed his coffee, buttered a piece of toast, and sat quietly in his kitchen. The house seemed to listen with him, the walls carrying the echoes of Margaret's voice, the soft patter of children's feet that once filled the halls. Now it was silent, waiting like he was. He dressed carefully, choosing a white shirt that Margaret had once ironed for church and the gray blazer he had worn only for weddings and funerals. Franklin wanted to look steady, not broken. When attorney Linda Chavez arrived to pick him up, she gave him a reassuring nod. "You ready?" she asked. Franklin answered, "Been ready since the day they tried to push me out." The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and rain-soaked coats. Franklin and Linda sat on a bench outside the courtroom, surrounded by strangers with their own troubles. His son David was already inside with his wife Veronica and that same slick young lawyer, who had first appeared in Franklin's kitchen. Franklin glimpsed them as he entered. David's shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, unable to meet his father's gaze. When the judge finally called the case, Franklin walked slowly but firmly to his seat. The courtroom lights were harsh, but Franklin lifted his chin. This wasn't about theater. This was about truth. Linda spoke first, her voice clear as glass. She laid out the facts. Franklin Miller, sole owner of the property for over 40 years. No power of attorney ever granted. No legal right for anyone's son or not to sell his home. And then she presented the handwriting expert's report. The signature on the sales contract. It's a forgery. The young attorney rose, smoothing his tie, and tried to paint a different picture. He said David had acted out of financial stress, that the sale was meant to support the family, and that Franklin, in his old age, had simply forgotten conversations or given consent without remembering. The words stung, but Franklin didn't flinch. Then the judge looked directly at him. "Mr. Miller, would you like to speak?" Franklin rose slowly, gripping the edge of the table for balance. He looked first at the judge, then at his son. Voice was steady, even warm, but carried the weight of decades. "This house isn't just walls, Your Honor. It's where I raise my boys. It's where my wife and I built a life from scratch, one paycheck at a time. I buried her memory in these rooms. I've carried my family on this land for years. And today, the very son I once held through asthma attacks and scraped knees, he brought a stranger into my kitchen to tell me I don't belong here. If that's not betrayal, I don't know what is." The room fell into silence, even David's. Lawyer seemed smaller in his chair. Franklin's words weren't fiery, but they cut deep. The judge nodded slowly. He read aloud the handwriting analysis, confirming that the signature was indeed forged. His ruling was swift, the contract null, and void, the sale blocked, and an investigation to begin into possible fraud. Franklin didn't cheer, didn't pump his fist. He simply closed his eyes for a moment and drew in a long breath, like a man resurfacing after being held underwater. When he stepped outside the courtroom, the drizzle had stopped. Waiting by the steps was Ethan, his grandson, holding a paper bag with a couple of sweet rolls. "We won, Grandpa," the boy whispered. Franklin smiled faintly and said, "No, son, we didn't win. We just made things right." Behind them, David lingered in the doorway. For the first time, Franklin saw not arrogance, but shame flicker across his son's face. He didn't approach, didn't speak, just turned away into the gray morning. Franklin placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, steady and strong. "The battle for the house was over. But the war inside a family's heart, well, it was just beginning. The courthouse victory should have brought Franklin peace. But peace rarely comes so quickly when family is involved. A week after the judge's ruling, son David appeared again, at the gate this time without a lawyer, without a polished speech. He stood outside in a wrinkled shirt, shifting from foot to foot like a schoolboy caught in a lie. Franklin opened the screen door, but didn't unlatch the gate. "What do you want, son?" he asked plainly. David cleared his throat, eyes darting away. I thought maybe we could talk." His voice was flat, thin, the kind of voice that carried more regret than courage. Franklin studied him for a long moment. The man standing there was not the boy he once carried on his shoulders, the boy who had fallen asleep in the cab of his truck on long hauls. This was a man weathered by choices that had left scars on both of them, against his better judgment. Franklin opened the gate. "Come in then. Say what you mean." Inside, the kitchen table felt colder than ever. Franklin poured 2 cups of coffee, though David only stared at his. The silence between them grew thick until David finally spoke. "Dad, we didn't need all this court business. Could have settled it in the family," Franklin let out. A slow breath, staring into his cup. "Family, David? You brought a stranger into my house and told me I didn't belong here? That wasn't family?" His words weren't loud, but they landed heavy. David looked down, lips pressed tight, had no answer. At that moment, the back door creaked open. Ethan, David's 17-year-old son, walked in. He froze when he saw his father sitting there, his jaw tightened. "What's he doing here?" The sharpness in his voice surprised even Franklin. David tried to steady himself. "Ethan, this is between your grandfather and me." But the boy shook his head. "No, it's about all of us. You tried to throw him out of his own house? Don't you get it? He's the reason we even had a home to grow up in." The kitchen went still. Franklin reached out and rested a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Easy, son. We're not here to fight." But Ethan's eyes glistened. "Grandpa, it's not right. You don't deserve this." His voice cracked, carrying both anger and loyalty. Franklin saw himself in that moment, Ethan's fire. His refusal to bow down to what was wrong, it stirred something deep in him. He nodded slowly. "I know it isn't right. But we'll face it with calm heads, not fists." David stood, his face flushed. "We're poisoning him against me," he snapped. Franklin's gaze hardened. "No, David, you did that yourself." The words hung in the air. David opened his mouth as if to speak again, but nothing came out. Finally, he turned and walked toward the door, shoulders slumped. He muttered. "You're making a mistake, Dad," Franklin replied softly. "No, the mistake was yours. I'm just not letting it finish me." The door closed with a dull thud. Silence returned, but it wasn't empty. Ethan sat down beside his grandfather, his hands still trembling. "I'm with you, Grandpa. Whatever happens." Franklin squeezed the boy's hand gently, his chest tightening with a mix of sorrow and pride. "Thank you, son. That means more than you'll ever know." Later that evening, the two of them sat on the porch as the sun dipped low over the Texas horizon. Franklin told Ethan stories he had never shared before about hauling lumber across state lines in his 20s. About the night Margaret went into labor during a thunderstorm, about how they built this very house piece by piece. Ethan listened with wide eyes, scribbling notes in a small notebook he carried. "I don't want anyone to forget this, Grandpa. Not me. Not anyone." Franklin smiled faintly. "And remember this. Dignity doesn't come from what you own. It comes from standing when the world expects you to fall." The boy nodded, the weight of those words settling deep. For the first time in weeks, Franklin felt a flicker of hope. His son had tried to discard him, but his grandson had chosen to stand by him. And sometimes, one loyal heart can heal what betrayal has broken. The days after David's visit carried a strange stillness. Franklin moved through his routines, feeding the dog, sweeping the porch, brewing his morning coffee. Yet inside, he felt both lighter and heavier at once. He had defended his home, his dignity, but the wound of betrayal still pulsed quietly. One quiet afternoon, as the autumn sun filtered through the blinds, Franklin noticed an envelope tucked under his front door. No stamp, no return address, just his name written in handwriting he hadn't seen in years. He sat at the kitchen table, the paper trembling in his hands. It was from Michael, his younger son. The last time Franklin had seen Michael was at Margaret's funeral nearly a decade ago. Michael had always been the distant one, quiet, stubborn in his own way. Living out in Arizona with a partner and a life far removed from family entanglements, their phone calls had been rare, and eventually they stopped altogether. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single page, written with uneven strokes, as if the words had been pulled from deep places. "Dad, I heard from Ethan what happened. I didn't know David had gone that far. I should have been here sooner. I've made my own mistakes, staying away, letting distance grow between us. But I need you to know, with you. If you'll let me, I want to come back and help." Franklin set the letter down, his chest tightening. He thought of the boy Michael once was, the quiet one who preferred sketching in notebooks over tossing footballs, the one who slipped out of family arguments without a word. For years, Franklin had mistaken that silence for indifference. Reading those lines, he realized it may have been something else. Fear, maybe shame, or simply the struggle of a son trying to find his own place. That evening, I sat on the porch as the cicadas buzzed in the trees. Ethan came by after school, still carrying his notebook full of scribbled memories. Franklin handed him the letter. The boy read silently, then looked up. "So, Uncle Michael's coming back?" "Maybe," Franklin replied, his voice softer than usual. "If he's ready, and if I'm ready to forgive." 2 days later, Franklin heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. A gray pickup truck pulled in. Out stepped Michael, older, more weathered, with streaks of silver in his hair and a backpack slung over his shoulder. He stood by the gate, hesitant, as if waiting for permission. Franklin walked out slowly. Their eyes met, and for a moment no words came. Finally, Michael spoke. "Dad, I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me." Franklin's throat tightened, but he managed a small nod. "You're here now. That's what matters." They sat in the kitchen over steaming mugs of coffee, just as Franklin had done days earlier with David, but this conversation carried no hostility, only a fragile attempt to bridge years of silence. Michael admitted he had heard about the court battle through Ethan. That guilt had gnawed at him for being absent so long. "I didn't leave because I stopped caring," Michael said quietly. "I left because I didn't know how to stay, watching Mom fade. Watching the family split, I couldn't handle it. And walking away was easier than facing all of it." Franklin listened, his rough hands folded on the table. The anger he thought he'd feel never came. Instead, there was a tired sort of compassion. "Son, I'm not asking for explanations. I just want honesty, and maybe a little time." Michael nodded, eyes wet. "That's more than I deserve." For the next few days, Michael stayed in the old guest room. He helped Franklin patch a leaking faucet, cleared out weeds by the fence, and repainted part of the porch railing. They didn't talk much at first, but the silence between them was not the same cold silence of the past. It was healing, patient, like two men learning how to breathe in the same rhythm again. One evening, as they sat outside with Ethan, Michael said something that caught Franklin off guard. "Dad, I don't want to just make up for lost time. I want to be part of what's ahead, whatever that looks like." Franklin looked at his son, then at his grandson, and felt something loosen inside him. The family he thought he had lost forever was not fully gone. Broken, yes, but not gone. For the first time in years, Franklin allowed himself a cautious smile. Maybe this story wasn't only about betrayal. Maybe it was also about the unexpected ways love finds its way back. The first crisp mornings of October rolled, in carrying with them the kind of air that makes a man think about change? Franklin Miller stood at the kitchen counter with a pen in hand, his old yellow legal pad spread before him. But instead of scribbling groceries or chores, he had drawn 3 neat columns. At the top, in his steady script, were the words, "What they know, what they don't, what I want them to think." It wasn't bitterness that pushed him to make the list. It was clarity. After months of betrayal, of silence, of courtroom battles, Franklin realized he could no longer afford to simply react. He needed to be the one steering his life. Every note he wrote felt like reclaiming a piece of himself that David's betrayal had tried to strip away. In the "what they know" column, he listed the obvious: the court ruling, the blocked sale, the house still in his name. Under "what they don't," he wrote down the steps he had already taken with Linda Chavez, the legal protections. The copies of deeds stored safely at the courthouse, the financial accounts Ethan had helped him update, and in the last column, "What I want them to think," he wrote something that made him chuckle under his breath, that "I'm too tired to fight again," because the truth was, he wasn't tired. For the first time in years, he felt alive with purpose. Later that week, Franklin boxed up items that belonged to David and Veronica, old clothes left in closets, photographs they'd discarded years ago, even a set of golf clubs that had collected dust in the garage. He neatly labeled each box with their names and called for a delivery service. When the driver asked if he wanted to include a message, Franklin smiled faintly and said, "Yes. Write this: returning what belongs to you, keeping what belongs to me." The act wasn't about spite. It was about boundaries. About drawing. A line so clear that even David couldn't ignore it. Michael watched from the porch as the truck pulled away. "That was bold, Dad," he said, admiration mixing with caution. Franklin shrugged. Sometimes you have to remind people where they end and you begin. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the Texas sky in streaks of orange, Franklin sat with Ethan and Michael on the porch. The boy asked, "Grandpa, aren't you afraid they'll come back angry?" Franklin leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "They already tried to take the roof over my head, son. They can huff and puff all they want. But this house isn't moving, neither am I," as if the words carried power. The very next day, David did show up, angry, red-faced, his voice sharp as gravel. He accused Franklin of humiliating him, of making him look like a fool in front of the family. But Franklin didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stood in the doorway, calm as stone, and said, "This conversation ends here." When David tried to push further, Franklin added, "I won't let you drag me into another fight. I've set my boundaries, and you will respect them. If you can't, then you're the one walking away, not me." David froze, stunned by his father's firmness. For the first time, he seemed to realize the old man he thought was fragile had found a strength sharper than anger, discipline, self-respect, unshakable resolve. Without another word, David turned and left. As the door clicked shut, Franklin exhaled slowly. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't burdened. He was steady. For years he had played the quiet man, the peacekeeper, the one who bore more than his share. But now, in the late season of his life, he had discovered something new: the quiet power of saying no. That night, Franklin lay in bed and thought of Margaret. He could almost hear her voice in the stillness. "You did it, Frank. You finally stood your ground." He smiled in the dark, a small, satisfied smile. The house around him felt different, not just a place of memories, but a fortress of dignity. And as he drifted to sleep, Franklin knew one truth above all else: they could try to take his possessions, his comfort, even his peace, but they could never again take his will. The weeks after David's last visit passed more quietly than Franklin expected. The phone calls stopped, the arguments ended, and the house settled into its old rhythm. But Franklin himself had changed. He wasn't just guarding the past anymore, he was carrying something forward. It started with Ethan. The boy had been scribbling in his notebook for months, capturing pieces of his grandfather's story. One Saturday morning, he came into the kitchen, holding a small stack of neatly typed pages. "Grandpa," he said, "I've been putting your stories together. Not just about the house, but your life, the trucking days, Grandma's strength, the fight you just went through. I think people need to hear it." Franklin chuckled softly, adjusting his glasses. "Who'd want to read about an old truck driver from Texas?" Ethan leaned forward, his voice full of conviction. "People like you, Grandpa. People who've worked hard, who've been overlooked, who've had to stand their ground when even family turned against them. Your story isn't just yours, it's theirs too." Asterisks those words stuck with Franklin. Thought about all the seniors in his church, the old neighbors who'd lost homes to rising taxes, friends who had been pushed aside by their own families. Maybe Ethan was right. Maybe his voice could carry further than he ever imagined. Not long after, Ethan convinced him to join a local community radio program. Franklin sat in a modest studio, microphone in front of him, heart pounding harder than it had in years. The host asked him one question. "Mr. Miller, what do you want people to take from your story?" Franklin hesitated, then spoke in a steady, warm voice. "That dignity isn't something you hand over, no matter how much pressure is put on you. A house is just wood and stone, but when it holds the life you built, it becomes sacred. Nobody, no son, no lawyer, no stranger has the right to take that away." The phones lit up after that broadcast. Letters started arriving at Franklin's mailbox, handwritten notes from seniors across Texas and beyond. Some thanked him for speaking words they had been too afraid to say. Others shared their own stories of betrayal and resilience. Each letter was proof that his fight had resonated far beyond the four walls of his house. One evening, Ethan handed him a small package. Inside was a self-published book, bound in simple brown cover, titled Franklin Miller, A Man Who Wouldn't Bow. Ethan had used his savings to print 10 copies. Franklin ran his rough fingers across the title, his eyes misting over. "You did this?" he asked softly. Ethan nodded. "It's just a start, but now your story is written down. It won't be forgotten." Franklin sat back in his chair, the book heavy in his lap. For years he had thought of himself as just an old man clinging to memories. Now, for the first time, he felt like part of something larger, a voice, a lesson, maybe even a legacy. That night, as the cicadas hummed outside, Franklin whispered into the quiet, "Margaret, we did it. Our story's going to outlive us." Franklin's story reminds us of a truth many forget. Growing older doesn't mean growing powerless. Your life, your dignity, your story, they matter. Sometimes by standing your ground, you don't. Just protect what's yours. You give courage to others who thought they were alone. So if you're listening right now, let Franklin's fight remind you. You are never too old to defend your worth. And you are never too small to leave a legacy. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand your ground to protect your dignity or your family? Share your story in the comments, I promise. Someone else out there needs to hear it. And if Franklin's journey touched your heart, don't forget to hit subscribe and join us for more powerful stories that honor the resilience in all of us.